Hello friends, if you hate communism, then why are you watching me on YouTube? Watch on Gab TV, also follow me on the regular Gab, thanks. There's exclusive content on there and you'll get more mature versions of my videos.
What came first, illegal immigration or the wall? The US-Mexico border is the most militarized border in the world, with the exception of the Korean DMZ.
Lies already? Wow, that was fast. Militarized borders are actually very common. Israel managed to prevent 99% of illegal immigration simply by building a wall. A melee battle with medieval weapons recently took place on the militarized border between India and China. That's because both countries forbid the use of firearms in the conflict. Speaking of China, we have this. Oh, and who could forget the border walls in Jordan and Afghanistan? The ones that the US taxpayers paid for? Yeah, America has done more to ensure border security than any other nation. And by that, I mean we ensured that the Middle East had secured borders. When it comes to the US itself, though, our leaders hate the people. They don't care about our security. The fact that our cities are overrun by drug addiction and crime just doesn't matter to these people. They stopped caring about us a long time ago. It's because they're selfish imperialists.
There are over 700 miles of fencing, patrolled by 20,000 Border Patrol agents. Each year, American taxpayers spend over $4.8 billion on Border Patrol and another $8.4 billion on immigrations and custom enforcement.
Well, how much money are we paying the 30,000 National Guard members in DC right now? It's pretty sad that we have to have more troops guarding Joe Biden than the entire US-Mexican border. But I guess the health and safety of America's first pedophile president is just more important for some reason.
Is our southern border really worth all the money and taxes we're pouring into it?
Is Joe Biden worth it? Doubt it. Before I debunk your nonsense, why don't you lay out what you think? We all know the Gravel Institute is just commie propaganda. So come on, Doug, let's dispense with the Socratic method.
Hello, I'm Dr. Douglas Massey. I'm a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University. I've been the director of the Mexican Migration Project since 1982.
Hello, I'm a bearded nobody. I get paid an outrageous amount of money to work 4 hours a week. I live in a wealthy neighborhood in New Jersey, almost 2,000 miles away from the US-Mexican border. Now let me explain to you why you're a racist.
I've been collecting real-time data on what's going on at the border, and none of the conclusions I've reached, to my knowledge, have ever been challenged by anyone.
Well, that's not going to be the case after this video, bud. Isn't scholarship supposed to be challenged? Don't we have this whole thing called peer review? When you get up on here and say, well, no one's really challenged this before, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence. All it does is just reinforce the idea that you're an out-of-touch, biased elite living in an echo chamber. I'm sorry, Doug, but I just don't care how much you enjoy sniffing your own farts.
What many Americans might not realize is just how new all of this border security is. In the early years of our republic, there was no firm borderline, only a fuzzy western frontier. As the frontier pushed westward, the border between America and its neighbors continued to be blurred.
When Europeans settled in America, 90% of the Native Americans died. If you want to understand why this is, then I recommend reading this really long book. Oh, you want the cliff notes? Okay. Well, white people had long lived in these disgusting cities. They would trade goods with these Middle Eastern people living in grungy hovels. The Middle Easterns in turn would trade with Indian people living in gross slums. Those Indians traded with Chinese living in dumpy, polluted cities. Having lived in gross, crowded cities and trading with other people in the same situation, the white people had super disease immunity. Most of the people in North America were hunter-gatherers. These people would have died out very quickly in large numbers. The only significant agricultural society in North America was the Aztecs. That civilization lived in the land area that would later become Mexico. Now, there were tribes living in the Mississippi Valley that had developed a primitive form of agriculture. They managed to take a variety of the Aztecs' corn that was able to grow in the environment of the southeastern United States. That variety of corn was tiny in comparison to the modern equivalent. While nominally agricultural, their society wasn't as sophisticated to support a large population that would develop disease immunity. So inevitably, they were conquered and displaced. After the Mississippi Valley tribes were conquered through the Trail of Tears, there really would have been no reason for the US to fortify its borders. That wouldn't have been the case until the United States butted up against the Mexico civilization.
When the southern border was finalized in the mid-1800s, it was still soft and porous, an invisible line on a map that ran through the middle of towns and even houses. In the early 1900s, labor shortages led many American farmers to begin recruiting field workers from Mexico. The work was seasonal, though, with workers coming from Mexico for the planting and harvest, and then returning to Mexico for the off-seasons. Because they only stayed for the harvest, Mexican workers were not considered immigrants and weren't included in early immigration laws that put quotas on other nations.
Well, in the early 20th century, we had something called the Bracero program. It was basically a guest worker program governed by treaties between the United States and Mexico. Through the program, Mexicans could work as seasonal laborers in the U.S. There were no need for border fortifications at this time because nothing unlawful was happening. Mexicans weren't streaming over a porous border taking whatever jobs they could get. They were coming as part of an established program set up by the government. The Bracero program was discontinued, largely due to objections by leftists, specifically Hispanic labor unions such as the one headed by Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez hated illegals who he called wetbacks. I'm not trying to be racist here. That insult was originally intended to apply to illegal workers and not Hispanics generally. Kind of like how redneck is only applied to certain whites.
The U.S. Border Patrol was established in 1924 not to prevent the entry of Mexicans, but to catch Europeans who were trying to get around the quotas at Ellis Island.
Okay, who cares? So Mexicans were trying to legally immigrate back then. Instead, it was Europeans. That doesn't matter. It's just whataboutism. Nobody who opposes illegal immigration does so because they just hate Mexicans. Let's get to the point already. For a 6-minute long video, this is taking forever to get anywhere.
During the Second World War, the U.S. government actually encouraged migration through a temporary worker program. The Bracero program was created in 1942 and steadily expanded after the war ended. By the late 1950s, it was recruiting around 450,000 Mexicans per year for temporary labor in the United States. Everything changed in 1965 when the Bracero program was ended and numerical limits were put on Mexican immigration for the first time.
What? The Bracero program was a guest worker program. It didn't allow Mexicans to immigrate at all. In fact, Mexican immigration wasn't allowed until the 1965 Immigration Act. This is why prior to that time, Mexican immigrants were often deported. They called it the Mexican repatriation. And I'm not saying that Mexicans couldn't be U.S. citizens. If you lived in the former Mexican territory acquired by the U.S. or you were born in America, yes, you were a citizen. However, until the 1965 Act, it was not considered legal for a Mexican national to immigrate into the United States.
Almost overnight, Mexico went from having access to around 500,000 legal visas to less than 20,000 permanent resident visas and no work visas. But the demand for agricultural labor didn't go away, and what was now unauthorized or illegal migration rose to fill the gap left by the end of the Bracero program. Border apprehensions went from 40,000 a year in 1965 to over 1.6 million in 1986.
Okay, let me get this straight. 500,000 Mexicans were allowed seasonal work as part of the Bracero program. Yet annually, 1.6 million people were being apprehended in a year's time in 1985. That would be strong evidence that the discontinuation of the Bracero program did not cause this. Let's assume only half of the people trying to cross end up getting apprehended. That means 3 million people were trying to cross each year. But we know that only 500,000 workers were needed to do the seasonal work as part of the Bracero program. So by these numbers, illegal immigration had gotten completely out of control at this point. We've gotten far from the point where these people were just working seasonal agricultural jobs. They were now all over the place in the United States competing with American citizens for jobs and welfare benefits.
However, these were still seasonal workers, and the flow was still circular, with 86% of undocumented workers returning home at the end of the season.
How is this even possible with the numbers that you just provided? Maybe someone isolated in a wealthy suburb next to Princeton University could believe this. To those of us living in the actual country, though, this is an obvious lie. It's obvious that 86% of Mexican laborers don't return to Mexico at the end of the harvest season. They're working jobs in fast food, hospitals, and construction. Are you telling me that those people go back at the end of the agricultural season? How stupid would someone have to be to believe this crap?
In practical terms, little had changed in the Mexican-American migration system. But in symbolic terms, much had changed. For now, the majority of migrants were illegal, and thus, by definition, considered to be criminals and lawbreakers.
So the Mexicans deported during the Mexican repatriation were viewed similarly. They weren't considered to be lawbreakers and criminals. I just have one question for you, Doug. If that's true, why did we deport them? You idiot!
While the demand for seasonal agricultural work stayed the same, what the government did was criminalize its workers.
Well, if the demand stayed the same, why would immigration need to be continued? If we need 500,000 seasonal agricultural workers, well, we're getting more than 3 times that. Every year! Even if we recreated the Bracero program, it wouldn't matter. There'd still be far more people coming than we needed.
Reacting to this perceived change, the U.S. government began pouring more and more resources into the Border Patrol. From 1986 to 2010, the number of uniformed Border Patrol officers increased 5.6 times.
This chart seems awfully familiar. Oh yeah, it's basically the same chart you just showed us, Doug. Are you listening, Doug? Okay, Doug, let me blow your mind here. As the rate of illegal immigration exploded, the government ended up having to hire more and more border patrol, had to devote more and more resources to preserve some semblance of rule of law. Let's apply this communist reasoning to murder. Let's say murders start increasing, so the police keep requesting more budget resources to investigate the murders. Doug's brilliant take on this would be, well, obviously the budget increases are what's causing the increase in murders. If we just stop enforcing murder laws, the problem will just solve itself. After all, murders used to be allowed, even though anyone who knows anything about history knows that murder was never allowed.
The agency's budget grew by a factor of 17, and hundreds of miles of walls and fencing were constructed around ports of entry. None of the extra border security did anything to stop border crossings.
Yeah, when Bush and Obama were president, it was catch and release. Anyone could just claim refugee status and they'd get to stay. When Donald Trump actually enforced immigration laws, this stopped. All of a sudden, the Border Patrol could do its job. Their job went from letting everyone claiming to be a refugee go to actually securing the border. And you know what? It worked well and it solved the problem of mass illegal immigration. The policy was also wildly popular, particularly with Hispanic Americans living in rural areas next to the border.
During the 1970s and 80s, the odds of a migrant being apprehended while crossing the border was about 1 in 3. As more resources were poured into the Border Patrol, migrants began crossing in more and more remote parts of the border, and the odds of a migrant being apprehended actually went down for a while. The diversion of border crossings into remote areas lowered the odds of apprehension, but it also increased the risk of injury and even death. For in addition to being less populated and less patrolled, these desolate areas were also more dangerous. Between 1993 and 2010, the number of deaths along the border skyrocketed.
Well, there are 2 methods to legally immigrate from the southern border. The first way is through the ports of entry. The second way is through the desert. Yeah, the desert is a more dangerous way. And the border wall is good because it helps prevent the desert from being an option. If you want to get in, you have to find some way through the port of entry. People do this hiding in cars, maybe they bribe the border patrol. If you don't want people to get hurt crossing through the desert, then the border wall actually makes a lot of sense.
Coyotes and other smugglers moved in to capitalize on the new black market, and border crossing became much more expensive. In the 2 decades after 1993, the cost of hiring a coyote to cross the border increased by a factor of 4.6 in real terms.
Wouldn't that suggest the border fortifications are working? It became more expensive and difficult for illegal immigrants to enter into the country. You're also missing a big point to this whole thing. Sure, I oppose illegal immigrants for many reasons. Yet there's a massive amount of human trafficking, slavery, and drug smuggling that takes place on the US-Mexican border. The more tools that law enforcement has to prevent slavery, sex trafficking, and Chinese fentanyl from entering the United States, the better.
But the biggest impact of increased border security was that for the first time in the history of Mexican-American migration, the movement of migrants stopped being circular, finding it increasingly difficult and dangerous and expensive to move back and forth across the border for seasonal work.
Except we already had enough workers to cover that a long time ago. By your own numbers, that problem was solved around 1967. We had enough people in our country to work all of those jobs at that point. Yet it continued nonstop and it got worse over time. These aren't people looking for seasonal agricultural work. They haven't been that way for a long time now. Treating them that way would be a huge mistake. These days, the people aren't even coming from Mexico anymore. Anyone in Mexico who wanted to live in the United States is already here. At a certain point, we have to draw a line. There are enough people here, especially when there's a pandemic, the economy is shut down, and unemployment is high. Only someone who really didn't care about the people of their own country would open up the borders under these conditions.
Migrants began staying in America during the off-seasons. As men stayed longer north of the border, they were increasingly joined by wives and children, transitioning from a seasonal migrant flow to a permanently settled population. In other words, the effect of restrictive immigration and border policies was the creation of an undocumented population. Removing the Bracero program made a traditional migratory system illegal. Building walls on the southern border didn't keep people out, but rather trapped them in.
The ideal would be to have borders like Israel. Don't let anyone across the southern border, period. Nothing gets passed. Sure, this would hurt our economy. Companies would have to find other ways to bring stuff over. But imagine how many lives we could save in both the US and Mexico. We could prevent all of this drug addiction and violence. Our leaders' insistence on open ports reveal their totalitarian ideological commitments. Just like Joseph Stalin allowed millions of people to die just so the USSR could have collective farms, Joe Biden is a prayer to allow millions of people to die in the US and Mexico just so the USA can have open borders. They'll die from cartel violence, drug dealing street gangs, and addiction. All of these deaths could be prevented by simply closing the ports of entry and completing the border wall. Any money that we make from the open ports of entry wouldn't be worth the millions of lives lost. Only someone like Stalin or Hitler would believe otherwise.
Since 2007, the number of undocumented migrants in the United States has actually declined, not because of the efforts of Border Patrol, but rather because of an unrelated shift in Mexican migration patterns. In the last 15 years, more people have moved from the U.S. to Mexico than from Mexico to the United States. This shift was started by the 2008 recession, but has been continued by a change in Mexico's age demographics.
Oh, I'm sure this has nothing to do with President Trump. It couldn't possibly be related to the fact that he made it much harder to legally immigrate here. There's no way that him standing up to China benefited the economy of both the United States as well as Mexico. Mexico's socialist president would never defend racist Trump for helping his country's economy. Not to speak of Mexico's own struggle with illegal immigration.
People tend to migrate when they're younger. If they do not move before the age of 30, they're very unlikely to move at all. In the last 50 years, Mexico's fertility rate has dropped from 7.2 children per woman to 2.1 children per woman, and the median age of the Mexican population has gone from 16.7 to 29.3, turning Mexico into an aging country. New undocumented immigrants in recent years have come not from Mexico, but from other countries.
Great, more whataboutism. Nobody who supports the border wall does it out of hatred of Mexico. We have a legal immigration system that already lets in way too many people. We don't need to add illegal immigrants on top of that. The fact that now people are coming from Central America or China doesn't matter. If they're not Americans, they don't belong here. If they want to come so badly, then comply with our immigration laws. Don't act like you're entitled to be here. Our ancestors fought and died for this country. We don't owe you anything. I'm certainly not going to let some worthless professor from New Jersey gaslight me into believing otherwise.
Today, most undocumented immigrants enter the United States legally. They enter as tourists and overstay their visas. Border security doesn't affect them. And yet still, to this day, there are calls to increase Border Patrol staffing and to build more barriers and to strengthen our borders.
All right, so your argument is we need more ICE and less Border Patrol. Right now, they're saying they want to put anyone who was at the Capitol building protests on do not fly list. Why don't we put people who overstay their visa on one? You get a warrant out for your arrest, and the only flight you get to take is one taking your ass back to whatever place you came from. Any country that took itself seriously would do something like this. It wouldn't spend millions of dollars on court hearings for every person who broke its extremely generous immigration laws. Anyways, I'd rather see that money spent on the border. Because again, the illegal immigration is only part of the problem. The drugs, slavery, and human trafficking are the much more significant issues. Those are the types of things happening on the US-Mexican border. You didn't even talk about them in this video. Yet you said at the outset no one has ever challenged your views on immigration. Really, Doug? Are you kidding me? Come on, Doug. No one's ever brought up drugs. Are you really in that big of an echo chamber? Why don't you come hang out with me on Gab for a while? Maybe you could learn something about what's happening in the real America.
Why? No matter which way you stand on the issue, there are better ways to address undocumented migration than a largely symbolic, totally ineffective, and extremely expensive border wall.
Yeah, you didn't prove any of that. Expensive in terms of what? If 100 slaves aren't brought into America because a portion of the border wall is extended, was that worth it? I'd say yes, because I don't support slavery. I don't think we should have sex slaves or forced labor in the United States. You clearly disagree with this, though. For you, spending money to prevent slavery is largely symbolic. It's extremely expensive. So what if I said to you, I don't think we need highways stretching across the US. I'm perfectly fine in my little town. I don't need to go anywhere. Building a massive cross-country highway would be largely symbolic. It would be extremely expensive. It would also be totally ineffective at dealing with the things that I personally am interested in. The country is far too big for the federal government to build an entire highway across the country. Doug, most people don't even drive when they travel. They take airplanes, right, Doug? In fact, we don't need the ports of entry for the same exact reason. The people can just fly. This guy didn't even argue that illegal immigration was good. He provided absolutely no evidence for anything. All he did was say that we used to allow illegal immigration, which is a lie. We didn't. We deported those people. Then he concludes by saying, well, people can just illegally immigrate through airports. So unless a method of border control is 100% effective, we just shouldn't engage in it. What a joke. Sorry, Gravel Institute, you're nothing but communist propaganda for the dumbest people on the internet. It doesn't take a genius to realize that illegal immigration or immigration in general is just a massive scam by the elite to lower the market cost of labor. Anyone purporting to be a leftist who supports this crap is just selling you a bunch of snake oil. Workers will only ever gain bargaining power in a situation where the market value for their labor increases. Therefore, if we want to help working people, we ought to restrict immigration. We ought to make it difficult to come into the country. We ought not to trust what a professor from Princeton University says. Why would anyone ever expect someone like that to give honest advice to working people? Yet there's no shortage of people who just believe this nonsense. Obviously, a Princeton professor said this, so it must be true. Look, the elite hates your gut, and if you believe otherwise, you're nothing but a bootlicking moron. Online censorship is a menace to our society. You can give a middle finger to Silicon Valley by following me on Gab. You'll find spicier content there and exclusive videos. But you know, I'll take what I can get. If you want to follow me on YouTube as well, that's great. Thanks for watching the video.